Well,
Thanks, Ron.
welcome.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, well, welcome, friends. This is another of this incredible series that we've put together for Better Together Thursdays as part of our regional assembly. And the days are counting down. We look forward to our regional assembly. That'll be in a digital format through Facebook Live on Saturday morning, October 3rd. So to remind everyone here to register yourself and register your voting delegates on the regional website, which will tell you how to do that. Otherwise, your folks who just want to observe can just tune in to Facebook Live. But to vote, you do need to register, and you'll be receiving an email ballot when the assembly begins on how to vote with instructions. That's kind of consistent with our bylaws, but certainly call me if you have any questions about that. But one of our workshops that was planned for Regional Assembly was going to be led by Tommy Goode on moral injury. And so we're so blessed that he has offered to share with us in this format what he has been working on as a recent, I don't know, lifelong endeavor, but I think all of us question ourselves, what is the purpose of trauma and suffering? How do we overcome it? How do we embrace it? How do we transform it? So I've been looking forward to this presentation as soon as I met Tommy, and he told me this is what he does and a passion of his. So Tommy is also one of our pastors, pastor down at Ozark Christian Church, and so glad that you are with us, Tommy. So take it away.
Thanks, Ron, and hello, everyone. Glad to have a chance to share and talk about this subject matter. Just a little history on it. I responded to an opportunity to go to a one-day seminar back in 2014 at Drury, where there Dr. Rita Brock did a presentation on, she was then attached to Bright Divinity School on the subject of moral soul repair, actually, is title of her book. And it was that, that presentation that kind of triggered a great deal of interest on my part. And so in 2015, I began a process of networking and communicating and training around particularly care for veterans who'd been exposed to trauma through combat and war and other conflict situations. And then as that moved along in 2018, I organized the Moral Injury Institute, and by that time had really zeroed in on the concept of moral injury as my preferred terminology for this struggle that not only does affect those who served in the military, but also others, particularly persons in professional life. And one of the kind of motivators, strong motivators for me, was the high statistic of suicide among veterans, physicians, clergy, others who have found suicide as their option for resolving the internal struggles that they didn't find any other way to deal with. So I grew up in a World War II veterans family. My father struggled quite severely and significantly with post-war trauma and also addiction and other things. And so for me, it's not just a philosophical kind of idea, but it's really a personal passion of mine. And the presentation today hopefully will speak some into your context or to your life. The other thing I would say about it is that it is just an introduction and it isn't, you know, comprehensive by that means. So hopefully it will begin a conversation, trigger some interest on your part. If you want more information or more contact from me, you'll be have the information how to follow up on that. So with all that said, let me go ahead and get to my slide presentation. And I'm going to talk from these slides primarily today, and there will be pauses along the way for us to have conversation as you may, things that come up in your mind. I'd suggest you make notes and write down your questions or your concerns or that sort of thing, so that we can make this more relevant to you and to our group today. This is contact information for me. I'm identifying myself today as the director of the Moral Injury Institute. I do have a website, moralinjuryinstitute.org. That phone number is the only phone I use. You can text or call there, or you could correspond in other ways through email or postal mail. I'm not a therapist. I've studied a lot of psychology, and I've been in the context of caregiving as a minister and a chaplain with many people who have, and I have great regard and respect for the mental health profession. But I want to disclaim that I'm not a therapist. Any statements that I make, you can fact check them or criticize them or disagree with them or whatever you wish for your own sense of accuracy and appropriate use. Presentation is designed for educational purposes. And then should you be one of those persons who struggles with traumatic PTSD and might be in current therapy or other wellness programming, I would just suggest that these conversations can be triggering. I don't have any graphic material in here, but just the conversation itself recalls memories and other trauma events and can be triggering. Should that be the case, please either leave the group safely or call on a friend or colleague and let us know. I am ordained minister for most of my life now. And I've served in congregational settings in Missouri, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Texas. Over 20 years of organizational consulting and training. And I began to focus on moral injury in 2018, as I said, with special emphasis on military veterans. And I have served in multiple roles as a chaplain or pastoral caregiver, spiritual care person in hospital, law enforcement, hospice, and home health settings. I'm currently, proudly, pastor of the Ozark Christian Church. I've been here since actually 2015, so quite a few years now. And I did with a few other people. You may know David Hawkins-Smith, that name. He's a co-founder with me for the Moral Injury Institute. And then I do organizational consulting as opportunity presents itself. The, excuse me while I clear my screen a little bit so I can see the top part of my screen. This presentation focuses then on role of church through pastoral and or congregational caregiving with an emphasis on caring for persons who've experienced trauma-related, either personal or professional levels of struggles with that then might be identified as moral injury, and we'll look at that definition in a little bit to get a little more clarity there. Here are the links to the online. Let me get back to that. I will Paul, I will, during one of our discussion times, I'll put those links into the chat box for folks to reach out to, okay? Since I'm unable to do it without changing my view. When we think about this as maybe for some of us, a first introduction to the subject, it's quite complex and quite elongated in terms of we could just go for hours, truthfully. But the learning comes from the interaction piece. So please be prepared to question, analyze, and interact with whatever levels of presentation. And if I don't get to the end of the presentation, that's just fine. We'll go as far as we have time for this morning. Here's a quote that I find meaningful as I began this conversation with you, and it's by Henry Nouwen, who says, when we honestly ask ourselves which person in our lives mean the most to us, we often find that it is those who, instead of giving advice or solutions or cures, have chosen rather to share our pain and touch our wounds with a warm and tender hand. The friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us in an hour of grief and bereavement, who can tolerate not knowing, not curing, not healing, and face with us the reality of our powerlessness, that is a friend who cares. And this quote is really profound as we get into understanding how we can best help and be caregivers and interventionists for persons with trauma-related moral injury. Key insights, excuse me, that I want you to follow along with today in this presentation have to do with these. One, moral injury, as I have come to understand it, is existential. It's whole person. There's not an aspect of one's life or identity that isn't somehow painted by the experience of moral injury. It may show up or demonstrate more in one arena or another, but it's a whole person kind of experience. The other is that moral injury does wear many, many masks and emotions. And so we can't just say definitively that when you see this, then you can be certain it's moral injury, because there may be other things going on, but there are ways to begin to find indicators that open conversations that I think are important. And then finally, about moral injury, we can help each other. This is when I get into the distinctions between PTSD and moral injury, one of the reasons that I chose to focus on moral injury is because moral injury is best resolved in relationships or in a community. And this is where we don't have to be mental health therapists or professionals, or we don't have to have a lot of psychological skill levels to care for somebody, to help someone. What we really need is to be very empathic, caring, compassionate, open-hearted, non-judgmental persons. And so we'll look at that toward the end of the presentation. Categories then of concern today have to do with trauma-related moral injury. And I do say trauma-related because not everything is moral injury, as I will be talking about it today. Traumatic events, it is understood through traumatic events, moral meaning, and behavioral effects. And so we'll see those clusters of identifiers in trauma-related moral injury. And then with this, there is healing and redemption. And those are, in our context today, probably very charged theological understandings or pastoral understandings. But, and I want us to be free to go there today in our discussion. There are two primary sources of reading that I would put on anybody's shelf if you want to read more about this. these are particularly written with military service persons in mind, but they're readable enough and the applications are broad enough that it's easy to transfer what you might glean from reading these two publications into the context of helping other persons in other settings. Adaptive Disclosure and Soul Repair. And that's the Rita Brock book that I mentioned earlier, Soul Repair. I'm currently, and I would hope you are reading something these days that are informing you about the stress and trauma that folk, every day when I open my emails, I have some new information piece talking about how stressful life is right now and how we need to be caring for one another and how we need to be practicing good mental health practices. And this is particularly true of clergy. So while the focus is on moral injury, the context you may be experiencing in terms of stress and trauma may be more generalized than that through, and it could be consequence of the environment we find ourselves in through COVID and other stressors of culture. Here's a book that I just was recently given that I have started to read, haven't finished yet. God and Pandemic by N.T. Wright. The last chapter is the one I really would recommend. It's on lament. And lament is hugely significant when looking at moral injury. What maybe are some of you reading or find helpful when you go to something that gives you insight and even reflection, meditation? Anybody? No readers out there?
I can jump in, Tommy. This week's daily meditations from the Center for Action and Contemplation by Richard Rohr, in fact, are talking about necessary suffering, sacred wounding in the context of Henry Nouwen's wisdom and some other voices. So I would encourage you, this is very timely, to look at that. And also, Drury University had a webinar on Tuesday night, which I hope is recorded, with the work of Stephanie Paulzell, which talks about spiritual wilderness because of this pandemic and also political divide. So I think great heads are coming together on this. I'm glad to know the N.T. Wright resource as well. So thank you. Be curious what others are reading too.
One of the things we here at our church subscribe to our daily bread devotionals, and we have several people who read them routinely. But there's one out now that I asked and Norma that we just, with Marna's help, we got some copies of, called "Clinging to Hope in the Storm," and written by Leslie Leyland Fields, and it's our daily bread devotional guide. So what I like about these devotional guides are that they, toward the end of that devotion, give you lines for making your own notes and reflections. Okay, well, I'll move along then. So let's just kind of dive straight into the conceptual content. We need to distinguish between PTSD, which is a fear-based psychological mental wellness diagnostic, and it often is observed in defensiveness, fight and flight, those kinds of triggering, and distinguish that from moral injury, which is emotion-based or affective. One of my friends here in Springfield who has helped do some presenting, Dr. Bucky Buckner, is quick to say that if we confuse moral injury with PTSD, it has as devastating effects as any other medical diagnostic would, and can be life-threatening, if not life-injuring. Trauma results from an experience or series of experiences and is expressed through behavior. So whether it's a twitch in your eye, or you can't sleep at night, or you're angry every day, or whatever the case might be, there's always a behavioral counterpart to trauma experience. Individual trauma results from series of events, sets of circumstances that is experienced as overwhelming or life-changing. It has profound impact or effects on the person's psychological well-being, and it does often include both physiological, social, and spiritual impacts. And this is from a source called Trauma-Informed Care National Learning Community. So what is trauma? This definition says that it has three elements. One, it's event or series of sets of circumstances. Two, it's experienced, it's experiential, and it's experiential in that it is life-altering. And then the third is that it has effects on that individual, as we've just described. If we think about trauma and its galaxy of impact on the human person, it shapes and reshapes or even contorts our beliefs, our worldview, our spirituality, and it is existential in that it reframes our sense of identity. And it does then result in what some have termed vicious looping. It recurs over and over, and or it can be triggered. This, I think, is a helpful and yet kind of disturbing statistic. This trauma-informed care community shares this idea of understanding how early childhood trauma impacts the person throughout life. And so the reason this is significant is because it does start out as an early childhood experience, but then it elevates or pyramids in our life, becoming disruptive in our development. It affects our social, cognitive, and emotional with impairment. It does have all kinds of health risks and disease patterns, and it can be traced and identified with early death. So it is life shortening, if not life disturbing. And here's the statistic that makes that important for us to pay attention to. When we think about trauma in our congregations or in our communities, prevalence of early childhood adverse experiences is at the rate of 56% of the general population, at least having one adverse childhood event. 26% of children in the US will witness or experience a traumatic event before they turn 4 years of age. 4 of every 10 children in America say they experienced a physical assault during the past year, with 1 in 10 receiving an assault-related injury. And then more than 60% of our youth aged 17 or younger have been exposed to crime, violence, abuse, either directly or indirectly. This is a nationwide research project that might be, it may be geographic in the sense that an urban or a more dense populated area may have more of this, but this is true across the board generally. Trauma-related moral injury is expressed in and by feelings. These are the most, if there's anything I want you to take away today, it's this working definition of moral injury. Expressed through feelings of guilt, shame, remorse, anger, despair, mistrust, loss of meaning, isolation, self-harming, and may lead to suicide. I think I stated earlier, the thing that got me really focused on the subject matter was the recurring statistic among military veterans that's been pretty stable now since around 2000. There are some 22 known suicides a day among military veterans. Now, and we also should be aware right now that ending life through suicide is really scaling up among teenagers and college age young adults. So we have a culture that is very prone toward suicide. What I want and what I hope to encourage you toward is to be an interventionist so that we get to, we stop that trend. Moral injury results when, and this is helpful to sort out moral injury from just a bad day. Moral injury results when a moral threshold is transgressed. So something that for whatever informs my morality, I have a notion, and all of us have a notion, if we do not have a personality disorder, all of us have a sense of right and wrong. And some of it's informed by our faith, by our religious teaching, by the family we grew up in, by our own choices and understanding about the world and life. And so when I participate either overtly or inadvertently in crossing one of these thresholds of right and wrong, and the result of that is in harm and injury to another person, I almost always will have moral injury. And for persons with PTSD, I think the science is beginning now to be clear that most, if not all, who have significant PTSD symptomology likely have moral injury. It's associated with traumatic experiences and it's connected to other behavioral issues. Here's a graphic that was published in the Huffington Post, I think, originally, but it comes out of the Science in Adaptive Disclosure publication, comparing and contrasting PTSD and moral injury. And so you can see on the left are some of the descriptors of PTSD: start reflex, memory loss, fear, and flashbacks. On the right, moral injury: sorrow, grief, regret, shame, and alienation. And then in the middle is where they tend to overlap. And these are the behavioral modifiers that we see or observe in ourselves and in others. One of the things that I probably won't get to today is to talk about grief, complicated grief. And that's really a whole nother circle of concern that persons who've experienced trauma and trauma-related moral injury often have, and that is unresolved or complicated grief. But today we'll just look at, these are the the ones where the arrows are, these are the things that we'll just kind of put into our understanding of moral injury. There is sorrow, there is grief, there is regret, there's shame, and there is a sense of alienation. NAMI is a resource that I hope all of you know about. If not, I want to inform you about this great organization. It's the National Alliance on Mental Health, and they do all kinds of training. They are based on a peer-to-peer caregiver model, and they are a great organization throughout our state, and you can go to their websites and find their resources. I've taken some of their seminars. They're really great, and I can't say enough good things about NAMI. But anyway, on NAMI, on their informational content, they talk about predictable stages of emotional reaction among family members when dealing with catastrophic events. And this is becoming more and more not just war-related or combat-related or military-related. This is now becoming more cultural in our society. And so you can just see the array of emotions that people may be struggling with. This may also help inform us in at least an understanding level of understanding why some of our current protests turn toward violence, because there is a great deal of fear, anger, and rage out there. And I'm not trying to oversimplify those situations. I'm just saying this helps inform. Another way, and I'm just trying to throw a variety of information toward you, the Army Ethics organization, Laura Copeland describes moral injury or the aftermath of it this way. Emotional response may include shame, which stems from global self-attributions like I'm an evil, terrible person, or I'm unforgivable, or from guilt, or from anxiety about possible consequences, or anger about betrayal based on moral injuries. And if we were talking specifically about persons who've served in the military, this would have a great deal more relevance for us. When we think about our spirituality, I'm not wanting to oversimplify, but this may help us to think largely or enlarge our thinking about our spirituality. That part of us that we refer to or contemplate as soul or spirit is the residue of our conscience, our empathy, our self-awareness. It's where we have that deep connection with what's good, true, beautiful, and it is reflective of our capacity to love, to show gratitude, even to play, to have compassion, and to experience peace. Shame and guilt, the distinction between guilt and shame comes down to an emphasis on self versus behavior. And I think this is informative, or it is for me. I did that horrible thing is guilt. I did that horrible thing is shame. Shame, while guilt and shame are associated with moral injury, shame is the bigger culprit and the harder to resolve. Shame is considered the more painful because one's core self, not simply one's behavior, is at stake. It is the existential piece of moral injury. And then shame can result from other people's, let me get back to that, perceptions. So a person may say, well, the reason I wouldn't talk about this is if you knew what I did, you wouldn't care or like me anymore, that kind of thing. Here's an insight into the gravity of moral injury from the perspective of someone who is a military veteran. The more time passes, the more that service member will become convinced and confident, not only their behavior, but they themselves are unforgivable. In other words, service members and veterans with moral injury, and I would say others too, fail to see a path toward renewal and reconciliation. They will fail to forgive themselves and experience self-condemnation, the behavioral, cognitive, emotional aftermath of unreconciled service moral conflict, severe moral conflict, withdrawal, self-condemnation, excuse me, closely mirrors the re-experiencing, avoidance, and emotional numbing symptoms of PTSD. And this is why oftentimes these are confused. A graphic here that I think helps us to think in terms of the life impact of these breaches of moral transgression. Without intervention, without healing and reconciliation, lead toward chronic psychology and chronic life situational harming, and may show up in all kinds of behaviors in terms of addictions or other self-harming behaviors and chronic illnesses. So here we go in terms of, and we're about to pause, so get your questions ready. Moral injury is damage to the soul of the individual. War is one of, but not the only thing that can cause this damage. Abuse, rape, violence cause the same type of damage. Soul repair, soul woundedness are terms that are already being used by those who are trying to understand moral injury and paths to recovery. So moral injury is emotion-based, and it's defined by feelings: guilt, shame, remorse, anger, despair, mistrust, loss of meaning, isolation, and is connected to self-harming. It is pervasive and persistent. Conversation, and I'm going to pause my share now so we can see each other. What are you thinking, hearing, feeling?
I'll jump in again, Tommy, and please let's hear from some others. But as you know, Walt Brueggemann looked at all the Psalms, entire Psalter, and realized that there are basically three categories of Psalms. That's orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. And Richard Rohr basically says the same thing: as our lives go from order to disorder to reorder. And Joseph Campbell affirmed in the hero's journey, and Richard Rohr again on the spiritual journey. All of those have suffering as the key transforming event in one's life. To using the terms necessary suffering, sacred wounding is not just something bad that happens, but is important for us to live into our state of being that God intended. Resurrection is another way to put that, and realizing that it's not God's will that we are harmed or injured, but yet life kind of happens sometimes, that there's a pivotal moment. It becomes our opportunity for transformation. And can you speak with kind of that purpose of moral injury, if you will?
Sure. the successful intervention of moral injury is to accept and come to terms with one's own sense of woundedness or failure. And that really becomes the, in our context today, the pastoral or the theological role of moral injury. The other is, how do we then find redemption? And I think the Psalms for, this Saturday, when we do this retreat, part of what we're going to do is spend time in the Psalms, looking at the Psalms of Lament, particularly. And the Psalms of Lament are desperate pleas for help and intervention, but they end in the prayer of the person of faith with confidence in the deliverer, in the righteous God. And so toward like a piece of this presentation content is to look at our symbols and resources and institutional meanings that we put to pain, suffering, regret, failure, and how do we move from that to a place of self-forgiveness, of forgiving others, of experiencing God's forgiveness. And that's the bigger and harder challenge, I think, because we are so private with our moral injury stories, because of it carries with it this sense of shame. And why would I want to tell you something I'm ashamed of? Just to be kind of candid about that. I had a recent conversation around this with some folks who were saying, well, their use of spiritual journaling was useful to them, and they found that helpful, a helpful way of telling of putting their story down, but because they felt they could say things in their journal they couldn't say in any other conversation. Now, I push back some on that. I think journaling is great, but my bias is that healing comes when I'm willing and able to share with another person who I can trust and who will not judge me and that sort of thing. So I don't want to just say that it's a contemplative solution. I think it's a community process that we find that solves it. And so anyway, I don't want to dominate the time here. If anybody else has anything to share. Okay, I'm going to move then on back into the presentation. I'm not going to review so much, but here's something I find useful to myself, hopefully you will, and that is to look at moral injury as in a galaxy of concerns. So moral injury kind of being at the center of this galaxy, but then there are other ways that it shows up or informs my life. Part of it may be PTSD or depression or substance abuse or use even, spiritual struggles, family conflict, anger, and so forth. So an intervention looks like something like this: creating a trusted, safe environment for that individual or persons. I've done this in small circles as well, to simply tell their trauma story. And I'm a huge proponent of this approach. However, especially when I'm talking to clergy, I remind us that not all clergy are capable of not being prescriptive. Not all clergy are capable of just being a listener, an empathic listener or deep listener. If, as a clergy person, you find yourself needing to be prescriptive, then you're probably not going to help someone with moral injury as much as you would like to. Practicing deep listening without judging or questioning, or doing something like this, well, how in the world could you have ever done that, or perhaps I could say, well, tell me what that felt like when you did that, or even worse, I might get off on, let me tell you my story, and we do that sometimes even in a meaningful way, but it's not helpful in this sense. The sharing of the trauma story for me, if someone chooses to share their trauma story with me, is a sacred moment. It is one that they have trusted me enough to let me hear that story, and I consider that a sacred trust. Lead or encourage the person in acts of confession and contrition, point to their need for forgiveness and healing of the darkness within, to the power of Christ and for healing. Help that person engage in acts of giving and kindness, which have been shown to help with a loss of hope. So the healing person and the person who's injured should show empathy toward oneself. The same strength that results in moral injury can be used in building and healing narrative for those who suffer. Forgiveness of self, forgiveness of others, recognition of symptomology, and then increasing self-regard and as well as self-regulation. And here's something, if you're wanting to look therapeutically at this model, you might look into the area of emotion-focused therapy, which helps persons reframe their trauma story or rescript it. There's also the use of positive psychology, have some good ways of helping reframe. And then forgiveness rituals. All of these I find useful. Any comments at this point? Okay, I'm going to share something that I can find it on my page here, that I use. I don't see it. Just a minute. I'm going to pull it up. It is a, let me get this stopped. It is a process of having a conversation. And here we go. So I call this an assessment narrative and inventory. And this is By the way, it's one of the links that I'll share that I have on my Google Drive. It's using some of the definitions and graphic illustrations that we've already seen, but then here it's moving into what I call storyboarding. And I think this is, whether it's your story or someone else's, this is a useful tool to begin to just understand and share that trauma memory or that trauma story. And it's like following a storyboarding narrative. Who was there? Who was involved? When did it happen? How did it happen? Or what took place? And then what did I feel, or what do I feel now as a result of that? Now, I know those are just an outline, but that's sufficient to get a story narrative in place. And then here is the analysis part of it. When you're working with someone as an interventionist or a caregiver, and they just on the basis of their self-assessment or your assessment of their story, you find, or they find, that shame is a part of that narrative, and it's in the red zone. It's really present with them. It's recurring. It has frequency. It is disruptive. It has intensity. Any of these categories, and you might add others, but it's sleep disturbing, despair, isolation, so forth. It's just a way of beginning to identify where is the individual on a scale of distress. And then on a scale of wellness or resiliency, how do we build into that experience, that person or ourselves, more resiliency, and look at our assets. What are we people of hope, forgiveness, acceptance? Or should we be in counseling? Have we worked on self-understanding? Have we done self-assessment? Are we working on our fitness, mental and physical wellness? Are we doing things in community to help give back and help make the world a better place? Are we doing things that bring us joy and happiness? Are we engaging in positive ways with family and friends? Are we reintegrating if we've been isolated? Are we moving back into integration? Where's the place of faith in our life, and how are we participating in community? So those are just some kind of entry-level ways of identifying both the distress as well as identifying assets that can build for resiliency. I probably should stop there. I just looked up at the clock. There are other things in here, and you can look at it if you want to, when you download the files that I'm going to share with you.
Well, thank you, Tommy. Does anybody have any directions for follow-up or inquiries or ideas that have spurned in your head that you wish to share?
I have a son-in-law who I'm now thinking maybe he has moral injury. He has always been a loner. He ended up marrying my daughter, who has 4 children already. And he was hearing things that weren't actually happening in the house. And he was blaming the kids for sabotaging him and things like that. And one day he heard these sounds when there was nobody else in the house. And so would that be some symptom of a moral injury?
That most likely PTSD or some form of mental health condition. It may have moral injury. It might help, if you had a conversation or if you heard this person talk about things that they regret, or, using some of those words, shame, regret, failure, fear, to have a conversation with them, you could do that. But I would say they need to be in mental health therapy myself.
Okay. Okay.
Tommy, why don't you talk about the workshop that is that you're hosting that's coming up that people can learn more information and participate in?
Sure, I'll be glad to. This Saturday here at our church in Ozark, and I'm doing it online as well. So we're offering a Zoom online option. We're going to have a morning session focused on, and it's all focused on clergy and or pastoral caregivers. So it may, most of the people will be ordained clergy, but not necessarily. And we're looking in the morning session at the struggle, the distress that clergy may be experiencing through trauma and personal and professional life experience, and just going through a couple of sessions of spiritual renewal, of meditation, of looking at lament, practice of meditation and prayer journaling and that kind of thing. And then I'm not doing that part of it. I have three of my friends here in the Springfield area who are doing that. And then in the afternoon, starting at 12:30, I will do a presentation on moral injury. And we'll be building that afternoon session more and more around this tool, this inventory tool I just shared with you, and how that it applies not only to the minister, but and that's our primary focus, but then helping the minister to self-identify and understand some of their own trauma and struggles so that they can be better caregivers and pastors, ministers to others. Because so often if you're struggling yourself and you're trying to help someone else who is in trauma, it triggers your own trauma to the point that you become disabled at to some extent in your ability to care, or you may find that was the case. But anyway, it's an all-day thing. We call it Clergy Renewal and Equipping Retreat on Moral Injury. It's free. You can show up at the door. We'll go from 9 a.m. to noon for the morning session, from 12:30 to 4 for the afternoon session. And the space here at the church, there's still enough opportunity for you if you wanted to come and be here in person. If not, then you can get in touch with me and I'll send you the link to the online option.
All right. Well, thank you, Tommy, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And we are certainly blessed to have Tommy's resource in our region, and I'm aware of other similar efforts that are out there. So please be in touch with me or Tommy, and we'll make sure that no one has to go through anything alone. There are a lot of conversation circles and sharing circles and resources and people willing to be there, to be present. So any last words from anybody, or then we'll help ourselves by perhaps having lunch.
Thanks again.
All right, thank you.